otherwise, just hanging out.
We're gonna start back at 2:05 to
what we're gonna do is Nick's gonna read 2:05, then I will gird my loins and read 2:06. And so there will be a short quiz after 2:06, which is Dr. Jung wrote these things in single thoughts, is the way Edinger put it. So I want to know what the single thought is in 2:06 after I get done. But the warm up will be 2:05. So go ahead, Nick.
Okay.
Good evening. Wait a minute. Good evening, everyone. This is the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group regular Monday night event, and please feel free to join us and ask questions on the chat. So go ahead, Nick.
It is to be assumed that all these contents are of a personal nature insofar as they are acquired during the individual's life. Since this life is limited, the number of acquired contents in the unconscious must also be limited. This being so, it might be thought possible to empty the unconscious either by analysis or by making a complete inventory of the unconscious contents, on the ground that the unconscious cannot produce anything more than what is already known and assimilated into consciousness. We should also have to suppose, as already said, that if one could arrest the descent of conscious contents into the unconscious by doing away with repression, unconscious productivity would be paralyzed. This is possible only to a very limited extent, as we know from experience. We urge our patients to hold fast to repressed contents that have been reassociated with consciousness and to assimilate them into their plan of life. But this procedure, as we may daily convince ourselves, makes no impression on the unconscious, since it calmly goes on producing dreams and fantasies which, according to Freud's original theory, must arise from personal repressions. If in such cases we pursue our observations systematically and without prejudice, we shall find material which, although similar in form to the previous personal contents, yet seems to contain illusions that go far beyond the personal sphere.
Okay. So this was part of our discussion last week, so I'm going to proceed with paragraph 206 now. And this is a complicated paragraph. As I said, Dr. Edinger observed that reading Jung is like reading a fruitcake. It has lots of interesting things in it, and each paragraph is sort of like a fruitcake in that it has one idea, thought, but it can be quite complicated. So this is going to be a 2-page reading almost. Paragraph 206. Casting about in my mind for an example to illustrate what I have just said, I have a particularly vivid memory of a woman patient with a mild hysterical neurosis, which, as we expressed it in those days, about 1910, had its principal cause in a father complex. By this, we wanted to denote the fact that the patient's peculiar relationship to her father stood in her way. She had been on very good terms with her father, who had since died. It was a relationship chiefly of feeling. In such cases, it is usually the intellectual function that is developed, and this later becomes the bridge to the world. Accordingly, our patient became a student of philosophy. Her energetic pursuit of knowledge was motivated by her need to extricate herself from the emotional entanglement with her father. This operation may succeed if her feelings can find an outlet of the new intellectual at a new intellectual level, perhaps in the formation of an emotional tie with a suitable man, equivalent to the former tie. In this particular case, however, the transition refused to take place because the patient's feelings remained suspended oscillating between her father and a man who was not altogether suitable. The progress of her life was thus held up, and that inner disunity is characteristic of a neurosis promptly made its appearance. The so-called normal person would probably be able to break the emotional bond in one or the other direction by a powerful act of will, or else, and this is perhaps the more usual thing, he would come through the difficulty unconsciously on the smooth path of instinct without ever being aware of the sort of conflict that lay behind his headaches or other physical discomforts. But any weakness of instinct, which may have many causes, is enough to hinder a smooth unconscious transition. Then all progress is delayed by conflict, and the resulting stasis of life is equivalent to a neurosis. In consequence of the standstill, psychic energy flows off in every conceivable direction, apparently quite uselessly. For instance, there are excessive innervations of the sympathetic system, which lead to nervous disorders of the stomach and intestines, or the vagus and consequently the heart is stimulated, or fantasies and memories, uninteresting enough in themselves, become overvalued and prey on the conscious mind, mountains out of molehills. In this state, a new motive is needed to put an end to the morbid suspension. Nature herself paves the way for this, unconsciously and indirectly, through the phenomenon of the transference, Freud. In the course of treatment, the patient transfers the father imago to the doctor, thus making him, in a sense, the father, and in the sense that he is not the father, also making him a substitute for the man she cannot reach. The doctor therefore becomes both a father and a kind of lover. In other words, an object of conflict. In him, the opposites are united, and for this reason, he stands for a quasi-ideal solution of the conflict. Without in the least wishing it, he draws upon himself an overvaluation that is almost incredible to the outsider, for to the patient he seems like a savior or a god. This way of speaking is not altogether so laughable as it sounds. It is indeed a bit much to be a father and lover at once. Nobody could possibly stand up to it in the long run, precisely because it is too much of a good thing. One would have to be a demigod, at least, to sustain such a role without a break. For all the time, one would have to be the giver. To the patient in the state of transference, this provisional solution naturally seems ideal, but only at first. In the end, she comes to a standstill that is just as bad as the neurotic conflict was. Fundamentally, nothing has yet happened that might lead to a real solution. The conflict has merely been transferred. Nevertheless, a successful transference can, at least temporarily, cause the whole neurosis to disappear. And for this reason, it has been very rightly recognized by Freud as a healing factor of first-rate importance. But at the same time, as a provisional state only, for although it holds out the possibility of a cure, it is far from being the cure itself. Okay. Comments, Nick?
Well, I don't know if it can really be boiled down to one thing, but it certainly seems like on the one hand, there's the relationship that this woman had with her father, which was predicated chiefly on filling. And then there's the attempt to kind of extricate herself from that relationship, which has more or less fallen back into the unconscious with the passing away of her father via some intellectual pursuit, which seemingly fails. And given that there's no serviceable transference of the kind of affective relationship with another man, she hits a standstill, hits an impasse, and then seems that Jung is saying that in an analysis, a transference might take place, which might hold out the possibility of a cure, but it would only be a temporary cure.
Right.
And I think that's what I
That's
got from it, which is just a reiteration of what's in the text.
right. Okay. Well, first of all, let's talk about what's going on. In all of our lives, there is a progression of things that have to happen. That progression includes things like your bones growing to a certain size, and other dynamics. Other developments are puberty, of course, and many other things. And so one of those progressions is that at first you have a father, whether you're a man or a woman, you have a father and you have a mother, and you have a certain interaction with them. But at some point after puberty, that relationship has to be somewhat cooled down so that there's room for a mate to be your primary contact, I would say. And so what we're saying here is this is an example of a disordered development of that kind. And you can get stuck even in analysis unless your therapist is, cotton to it, unless he's aware of it. And Jung talks in Memories, Dreams, Reflections about the first time he realized that he had become the object of a transference by a female patient. And he realized that he had to explain to her that he was not her father, and that, she would have to go on with life without him. And they had become quite close, apparently. And this was especially happening with difficulty in the early days of psychotherapy, before there were guardrails in terms of how close you could get to a client ethically and so on. So, Jordan, you want to talk about this a bit?
Yeah, I think it's a two-pronged example of an antiodromia, where first off, the first prong would be the imbalance of psychological overcompensation when one lives primarily through another. In essence, intellectual surges forward in her life when feeling has been her primary influence. So in that point, long-term deflation occurs from the intellectual roadblock. When someone can't stomach something, they consequently can't digest past the roadblock to proceed. And it pushes me back to what I feel one of the core ideas of paragraph 205, where there's somewhat of a Moses parts the Red Sea. So without repression, there's a flood. It's all ocean. It's beyond ambivalent. You can't choose because everything's present. I guess a divine example would be, omniscience. If you know everything, how can you choose anything? But then when Moses parts the Red Sea, the unconscious passage across the Red Sea to the conscious, you see that the father on the left, unconscious, could cross over to transfer into her masculine inner qualities, or the suitable partner that she's looking at on the right. So the ocean could, in a sense, hand off to the other. That, though, to me becomes then displacement rather than her digesting the impasse of her, I would say, overcompensatory imbalance of proceeding through the intellect because she's missed it growing up. So she's over focused on that, and she is steeped only in the feeling. So it feels like the enantiodromia of, if there's imbalance, compensation and overcompensation tends to always occur.
Right. And one other thing, we have to take steps up in our consciousness. And that's not necessarily clear at the beginning, but it's what in the Bible is recognized as Jacob's ladder, where you are at one level and then you integrate that level and then move up to the next level. And this is happening throughout life. So you can be a fully realized adept and still need further development, or still fall off the wagon, as Jung was known to do, at least early on in his career. Jewel, do you want to say anything about this?
As a female, I'm identifying with like loving your father. And you mentioned the natural thing of growing up as a child, that is so normal. Then when you hit puberty and stuff and things start changing within your body, you know, when boys didn't like girls, girls didn't like boys. And then, so when it goes to me, the natural progression, if we have an unhealthy father who doesn't want to let go of that young lady, then that's going to cause conflict within her. And that's where I like the part talking about the intellectual. You get stuck there because I'm supposed to, but I'm feeling something that may not be, it's new and it may not be natural.
Yeah. Well, or
I think he's going on with that. Yeah, I like what
yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that most people develop naturally. And so we're talking people who've gone to a psychotherapist are already outliers, who, you know, can't get past a certain roadblock in their development. And then the therapist is a person that can come to the rescue and give guidance of how to get past a certain stage and go up in the spiral toward maturity and toward individuation ultimately, which is a natural phenomenon. Okay, it's not something you decide upon, it's something your psyche decides upon.
You know, I think what I was driving at, I think you, Skip, hit the nail on the head in 3 words. And you said, take steps up, the integration of Jacob's ladder, because I think then that breeds perspective. And then, for example, if I stick with my Moses and the Red Sea parted, then by taking the steps up, she'll see the left, she'll see the right, she'll see the passage through, and she can make choices to integrate, to cross, to not cross, or to find her own way. But simply because then she's not at the beck and call of her dad or the suitor, or even herself in the passage expected in the middle. She has the perspective to choose to make another path or to integrate the whole thing and move on. So I think your 3 words, take steps up, that creates perspective, really, I think, hit my point nail on the head a little more concisely than what I had said.
And I like that it brings out the difference between Jung and Freud in this, and that is moving on up in life.
Yes.
I think it's also worth mentioning that, you know, a considerable amount of people working in the field have also noted that whatever individuation is as a process, it's certainly not a straight line, or it's not climbing Jacob's ladder or what have you. It's something like a spiral, and then it doubles back on itself all the time too. And I think it's really interesting to look at the kind of developmental arc of this young woman and consider that if on the one hand her father hadn't passed away, there probably would be nothing to really even consider. And it's only at the passing of her father that things seemingly doubled back on themselves, and then a problem really made itself known.
Okay,
I really appreciate that, Nick, because that brings up the spiraling around, which goes up, never touches itself again, actually does double back on itself in reality. And I think that's not a paradox. It reminds me of a hermit story I told one year where the hermit stands on the precipice and he steps off into the mud and he stands there, and then he takes his passage. And years later, he comes back around to the same precipice and he sees these footprints, and he doesn't remember, this place. It's as if it's new, but he steps into the feet that are like concrete hardened mud, and he realizes, oh, these are my shoes of the earth, the first steps he took. But then when he takes a step out of them, like you said, that's the doubling back right there, except he and the place are both different. And so I appreciate when you made the doubling back in the spiral statement, because that keeps it, I think, not tethered to reality. It keeps it tethered to experience, so that can continue to evolve.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
there's a really great book called Becoming by Deldon Ann McNeely. She's a Jungian analyst from, I think, Louisiana.
What's her first name?
Deldon Ann McNeely.
Okay.
It's a great book, but in that book, she outlines this idea of there being heroic or mercurial individuation. And heroic is the one that's just a straight line, and that's seems like something of a myth, right? Which seems apropos with the heroic piece. But and then the mercurial, which is always kind of doubling back on itself, and it's kind of like a winding snake or something like that, which I think is a little more realistic.
That's a good point, because the heroic would be like the 100-yard dash from birth to death. And then the mercurial would experience all the steps along the way, more like a turtle. And there's doubling back in each step, which then takes it past just that 100-yard dash, so to speak.
It's easy just to slide into idealism with this kind of thing too, and to not be as kind of, I wouldn't say easy on oneself, but to have compassion for the process rather than just thinking, I've got to achieve every damn thing along the way.
Well, yeah, I think that the achievement piece is also the myth. I mean, you do achieve, but it's not the destination. And it's almost even beyond the journey as the process, where it's the experience of how you are basically becoming your next new larger 100%. I mean, the expansion, I love it. I used to say, oh, bad coaches math, you can't give your 110%. But what that really means is you expand larger to a new 100%. That's then consequently 10% larger. I mean, so there's that pulsing piece, which would be the mercurial individuation you're mentioning from Delvin and McNeely, rather than the heroic, which is just a straight shot, which that's just the arrow to the target. It has no resistance except the air and the wind. There's really no experience along the way for the arrow.
Yeah. Who wants to do those seven?
And you have to realize that your coach, your person that's helping you get to the next level, isn't necessarily a psychotherapist. It might be a football coach, or I was thinking of the movie Top Gun, where Maverick has a problem, and then the CO tells the executive officer to get him back up in the plane, because otherwise he's going to regress. And of course, these guys are pretty expensive guys, so you don't want to have them regress.
Well, that's a really good example in that movie, especially that whole montage and several scenes where get him back up there, get him up there. And then what happens is then they have the patience and the inaction occurring in what they're looking to do. So he's not going to have some epiphany on the ground and, erp up knowledge and then, oh, now I can fly again. It's not going to be a head thing. He's going to have to be steeped in swimming, Mach 3 with his hair on fire, as the movie goes, to a point to get back to past that point with the experience of Goose, the flat spin and him dying.
Yeah. Okay. Joel, do you want to go ahead and read 207?
Sure. This is somewhat lengthy discussion seems to me essential if my example was to be understood for my patient and arrived at the state of transference and has already reached the upper limit and where the standstill begins to make itself disagreeable. The question now arose, what next? I had, of course, become the complete savior, and the thought of having to give up was only exceedingly distasteful to the patient, but also positively terrifying. In the situation, sound common sense generally comes out of the whole repertory of say it for me.
Admonition.
I can't get it out. Okay. You simply must. You really ought. You cannot. So far as common sense is, happily, not too rare and not entirely without effect. Pessimists I know exist. A rational motive can, an exuberant feeling of buoyancy, you get from the transference release so much enthusiasm that a painful sacrifice can be risked with a mighty effort of will. It's successful that these sometimes are. The sacrificial bears blessed fruit, and the earnest patience leaps at one bound into the state of being practically cured. The doctor is generally so delighted that he fails to tackle the theoretical difficulties connected with this little miracle.
Okay, Nick.
Nick, I really like how this speaks to both that heroic individuation and mercurial individuation, where that mighty effort of will would be these little heroic A to B, B to C gestures that occur through the mercurial experience of the whole piece. It seems like that instead of then the heroic being this, one lump sum, whole life in a moment, birth to death, that the heroic piece is the continue living, continue acting. As Skip's example, get him back up there, get him in the plane, and living through the action, even if you're in complete inaction. Just, I think it's funny, just flying an F-15. I mean, it's so if someone on autopilot just hanging out in a $30 million plane, that's an event in itself, but he's not pushing those limits. So it's interesting to me, going back to the heroic individuation as the actions, the little mighty acts of will in the context of the mercurial.
I think of that as like going to that aha, like, oh, I love my daddy. He's not here. And then you see relationships in life. It's when that aha, and now I'm a young lady. And when I saw my parents together, it was different. And it was a different kind of love. It's that moving up another step and the awareness that comes within us as we change and grow.
Yeah, and before you get to that point, there's often a lot of conflict between mothers and daughters, particularly. As the old saying goes, when you were 15, you thought your parents were crazy, and when you get to be 30, you think, wow, I'm surprised at how Much my parents have matured.
Learned. Yeah, they've learned a lot in 15 years.
That's what it took me back as I read this earlier, just without watching a flower bloom.
Yeah.
Well, that reminds me of one of the last birthday cards I gave my dad before he had Parkinson's, and his, wit, emotion, and intellect were still all just full on present. And he laughed about this card for years, and it would just come up when he started laughing. There was a certain way you could tell he'd think about the card. And all I said in the card was, "Dear Dad, thanks so much for giving me just enough emotional baggage to comfortably go into a creative career, but not so much that I went into prostitution."
Yeah.
And he just always just get tickled all the time about that. But that's that whole, Jewel, you see things in a different light. That was taking all the conflict, but sticking it into something. This is what I did with it,
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, Jordan, how long did the devolution take in your father's Parkinson's?
For 4.5 years. Mm-hmm. And I would say total 5.5 years. There was some kind of, what was that? That's, my dad's different. But the first piece at the beginning of that 4.5 years, I think he probably had it at an onset a year prior. He was doing a poetry reading, and they're dramatic pauses, and that's expected. So in a sense, it's overt, but it's hidden. But a doctor sitting behind my stepmother in the audience, tapped her on the shoulder and says, "Does your husband have Parkinson's?" And she's, "What do you mean?" He has a silver glisten on his eyes. Mm-hmm. And that's somewhat indicative. It's almost like mercury coating the eyes in a way. Mm-hmm. But from that point, they went in that week, and from that point, it was about 4.5 years.
Okay. And did he try to slow it up at all?
Yeah, he did. He did boxing therapy and dancing therapy. There were.
But he didn't try to medication. Oh, there were medications.
Yeah, there were medications that he took, some experimental ones that had good success, and it would keep it at bay. And part of it was too his fighter spirit. And he had been a marathoner and 100-mile bike racer, not just rider. I mean, he would ride the 105 degrees in North Texas, and you're riding 100 miles for time. And it's interesting because I think it looked like he was making progress until then he had a massive heart attack when they went up to the cabin a year and a half before. He got to the top of, the 5 steps up to the deck and just doubled over. And fortunately, my stepmom had kept medevac insurance, so because there were no ambulance getting up to the cabin, and they flew him out. But that heart attack took him down. But what's interesting, it was almost a little blip. Within 6 weeks, he was fully walking without a cane, and the progress resumed. But so it was an interesting, deceptive 4.5-year process. And then,
well, that's quite short for people I know, including Debbie's father, who had Parkinson's for about 15 years. Mm-hmm. I don't know what treatments he had, but I used to play bridge with John McCain's sister, and it took her a good 15 years, if not longer. She was getting very good treatment, of course. But anyway, let's go on with psychology. And Jordan, do you want to take 208?
Certainly. Paragraph 208. If the leap does not succeed, and it did not succeed with my patient, one is then faced with the problem of resolving the transference. Here, quote unquote, psychoanalytic theory shrouds itself in a thick darkness. Apparently, we are to fall back on some nebulous trust in fate. Somehow or other, the matter will settle itself. The transference stops automatically when the patient runs out of money. As a as a slightly cynical colleague once remarked to me, or the ineluctable demands of life make it impossible for the patient to linger on in the transference, demands which compel the involuntary sacrifice, sometimes with a more or less complete relapse as a result. In parentheses, one may look in vain for accounts of such cases in the books that sing the praises of psychoanalysis.
Yeah. As Hillman said, at the end of his life, we've had 100 years of psychoanalysis and things are getting worse.
Yeah.
And okay.
Well, that's a wonderful comment too, because I think what's interesting is psychoanalysis then in that sense, necessity is the mother of invention. It was getting worse coming into, we have more light, think about how much light we live in. John Jackson made this point a couple of weeks ago. Whereas at the turn of the century, at nighttime, it was dark. You had candles or you didn't. But when day was day, night was night. And during the day, if it was stormy, it was darker. Now we can live in a state of light, like all this. We even have virtual backgrounds, false light. We have our fake light that is pretty, know. And I wonder if then psychology then not just was a creative miracle, Freud, Jung, William James, Nietzsche, philosophers through time, leading up to it. But then as society became more light, there's an imbalance of the dark missing. And so the dark now kind of comes out more because there's an uncompensatory piece of the shadow is not always present. So then it gets compensatory. So it's interesting. I think there's a lot loaded in that statement from Edinger, because I don't think it's because psychology made it worse or psychoanalysis. I think that it was the antidote, but it's small in context and honestly in a 100-year drop in the bucket, relatively new.
I mean, that's Nietzsche's like primary critique of Western civilization, that all Western civilizations have become overly Apollonian and they've lost their connection to the Dionysian.
Yes.
And you're saying that in psychological types, Jung takes up that interplay between Apollo and Dionysus.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really funny too, if you even think about somebody like Freud, you could even look at psychoanalysis as being this kind of like, we're putting the psyche under a light and trying to perfectly analyze it and just empty everything out of it. It's this obsession with the perfectly ordered psyche. And that's all to do with Apollo. That's all to do with the Apollonian.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's a really good point, because I remember this summer when it's, the power went off. Oh, well, that's how you know it's Taos. So, just every once in a while it does, or animal gets in a transformer. But it's interesting because the quiet, no fridge noise, no light hum of the lights. And immediately I just looked over and went, oh. And it's that Dionysian Apollonian piece. I went, I should do this. So once a week for an hour, I just go to breaker box and close my eyes or not and hang out with no electricity. And there's that Dionysian. I feel like even in my living room, I'm in nature. So I think that's a great point you make, Nick, with it's too Apollonian. It's almost too pretty to be worth anything if it's, doesn't have the shadow.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Apollo and Artemis were brother and sister, I believe, but Dionysus is not necessarily didn't have anything to do with darkness per se, but it was the difference between order and differentiation, insight and light and stuff like that, and rationality really, versus kind of orgiastic merging with others and wild rites and stuff with Dionysus, and kind of losing oneself rather than separating oneself.
Well, yeah, even in the quote of everything in moderation, including moderation. Well, everything in moderation is very Apollonian, very pretty, very ordered, including moderation. So putting moderation in moderation, which is that, orgiastic excess you're talking about, there's the Dionysian. And just too much of one or the other.
Yeah,
let's go back
Tarnas-
to make one point about Tarnas, and then let's go back to this point here.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to say Richard Tarnas starts his book, The Passion of the Western Mind, with a quote from Nietzsche that I think is really brilliant, and I think it's reads something like, "The world is deep, deeper than day can comprehend."
Right.
Mm-hmm. That's
And,
yeah.
And so, meanwhile, let's talk about this ethical issue. Okay, the ethical issue of the patient hasn't cleared the transference and they run out of money, and you just stop them, you drop them right then. What do you do? I mean, that's the kind of conflict that I often got into in practicing law also, where or honestly, I got into it with doing what I'm doing here because I was trying to get folks to pay me something for what I do, and very few people paid anything. And so the conflict is, do you keep going because you believe in what you're doing, or do you cut the whole thing off? So the
I
same,
think that goes to your
so that's the issue for psychotherapists, which is, it's not everybody that can afford $150 an hour every week, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that goes to your point of the church as the original, and maybe it's the slide you have, maybe it's Jung, but the church as the original psychotherapeutic event. And think about it, there's an offertory plate passed around to drop money in, and then you go to the one person instead of the one church, the psychoanalysis, the analyst. Wow, talk about the spiral circling around, Nick. You go to the analyst and you pay them. So for that, church of the room of one, and you and them, and but anyone can go into the church for free, pretty much. You don't have to donate. And then I think you bring up the ethics piece too of, well, look at all of the scandals in the church, and then the scandals from psychoanalysis of that time where boundaries were not even hardly present in a way in a lot of places. I mean, not to accuse anybody or be punitive, but at the same time, it was just people of their time, the thoughts of how boundaries were present were completely different than they are now. They were very much less empathic from a gender perspective, one way to the other, which there's an evolution there now where you at least have some regulation that ties the hands of the unethical in a way to try to push them off from doing untoward things.
It's a really complicated question, however. I mean, there's so many aspects to it, because on the one hand, I find myself wondering if, Jung talks about this in a way where he really falls back on this being something of a natural process. And it leads me to wonder, are therapists absolutely necessary in the resolution of such a conflict always? And I don't think that's the case always.
Yeah, it's not.
But it's
certainly
also
not the case always, and it with a little guidance, it may not be the case almost ever, except for biological disease or defect, which is psychosis. But for neurosis, I'm sure that a lot of neuroses are resolved by a good friend over coffee or beer. and
perhaps, and it's also worth mentioning that everybody's neurotic. I mean,
everybody's neurotic, surely,
and touched by a bit of neuroticism,
right? And the reason I go on is because it feeds my soul, okay, and I recognize that I'm doing it not only for others, but also for myself. And so I don't stop for that reason. And also I get free consultation from Jordan on a regular basis, so.
Unprofessional, of course, but no, that's funny. Well, it's interesting too, because I remember walking across the room at a party, and it was at my house, so this wasn't terribly rude, obviously. And I just stopped and looked down at the top of this table, and I turned and I went to one side, and I'm looking, and my girlfriend walks up and goes, "What's so fascinating on the table?" And I reached down, and there was this candle, and I just turned. I went, "Oh, it's so much better." And I walked away. And she said, "Do you have OCD?" I said, No. OCD is a disorder. I have Arranger syndrome. It's a function of being an aesthete. If it's not beautiful, you should make it that way. So, and she turned it back where it was, and I just looked, and I had to like resist. I just had to look up and smile, but I had to resist going back and turning it back. We were going to get in this chess game of the candle by 3 degrees, So, but yeah, is it a disorder? Or like Nick said, we've all got a little bit of actually choice and bias. What are we predisposed? What do we like? What do we don't like? And that ends up being healthy. Usually.
And differentiating.
Right. I mean, the one thing that always just set me off was somebody scraping metal or something else across a chalkboard.
You would have hated me in school.
I don't think you're alone on that one.
Yeah. It makes my fingernails itch. And even thinking about it makes my fingernails itch.
I taught architecture to third graders in a pilot program through thesis, and honestly, they were better than most of my colleagues. But in this honors program, every once in a while, of course, if I got boring, they're third graders. They're not having any of that, so they start to get unruly. It starts a little and moves around, and boom, the whole room is. And I would just walk up to the chalkboard and just drag my nails. And I would walk all the way across the 10, 15 feet of the chalkboard. And I'd turn around, and they're all just.
Yeah.
And shall I continue? Just don't do that again. So.
Okay, Nick, do you want to read number 209? I guess
Sure.
it is.
To be sure, there are hopeless cases where nothing helps, but there are also cases that do not get stuck and do not inevitably leave the transference situation with bitter hearts and sore heads. I told myself at this juncture with my patient that there must be a clear and respectable way out of the impasse. My patient had long since run out of money, if indeed she ever possessed any, but I was curious to know what means nature would devise for a satisfactory way out of the transference deadlock. Since I never imagined that I was blessed with that sound common sense, which always knows exactly what to do in every quandary, and since my patient knew as little as I suggested to her that we could at least keep an eye open for any movements coming from a sphere of the psyche uncontaminated by our superior wisdom and our conscious plannings. That meant first and foremost her dreams.
Okay, well, Jung was blessed by one thing, and that was that he married the third wealthiest woman in Switzerland,
Right.
And whose father was the founder of IWC, and who promptly checked out of life because he had syphilis. And the reason Jung got to know Emma at all when he was in his early 20s and she was 14 was because, first of all, her mother had pushed the baby carriage when Jung was an infant. And so there was a relationship with the family. but also it was because of the syphilis. He kept coming back to the house. He was the only doctor that they would reveal the facts, and so her father didn't come to their wedding, and I think died shortly after, if I recall. But because my point with respect to this section is he could afford to go without fees,
Right.
at that time, and so it's not that I can't afford to go without payments from people, because I can.
I mean, honestly, this is speculation, pure speculation. But I would imagine that once you develop the kind of relationship with somebody where you've been working with them for X amount of sessions or months or what have you, that you have a vested interest just as much as they do in making sure that they're okay. And I would think that
well, surely if you open somebody up that much, yes, definitely.
And Nick, I would take that right out of speculation. I would put it right into reality. I've had a couple clients that hit those points, but at the same time, they hit the point of almost poverty. And I'm like, look, we built a relationship. The only thing we really need to do is keep the same bad channel, and don't even make tick marks as to how many sessions. I want you to forget about that. And part of that, I think, actually gives them I still have value, because I'm not abandoning them. Mm-hmm. And again, I say that with there have been times in my life that I was like, wow, I better sell 3 $7.80 PDFs or I'm not going to have dinner. I mean, or, food for a week or whatever. And there's a point too, then, when money's not an issue and it becomes value of itself, and then you can do things like that and without hurting yourself. So I think the two-way street is you don't want to dive in the same pool they're in. That's a bad form of perspective, but at the same time, I think your speculation is dead on, because you've created a relationship and it's beyond just being vested. And this is another human being, and I have helped them come here. So in one sense, I'm responsible.
Yeah.
It's not my responsibility.
You have to feel the responsibility. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The human thing comes in, but I would think also based on Jung's concept of the countertransference, and also just, the inevitable aspect of human pride, that, he has just as much a reason to see it through to its end as a patient would.
Well, surely. And once you develop a cash flow as a psychotherapist or any other professional, presumably, you can afford to take some pro bono work, and not all work is pro bono, right?
I had a rule back when I had my architecture firm, is 10% of my time at least has to be community service of some form or another. And now with architecture, there's too much liability to do pro bono architecture, because that wouldn't cover any attorney's fees, which fortunately I didn't have many of, because I was an expert witness. But coming around to what I do now, and instead of volunteerism and community service in the big picture, like not being like chair of community form and identity as a volunteer for a year or so for a municipality, it's become, I think back to Nick's piece, if I drop them because they can't afford it after one reading, that doesn't matter. That's a one-off. But if there's an established relationship, if I abandon them, so to speak, or just say, oh, well, growth has to pay its own way, put my foot down, well, they're not going to trust a therapist or another reader ever again. Mm-hmm. They're going to have the bad taste in their mouth of, even when they come to the time of it's time for them to make more progress and they're ready, they won't, because now they think their therapist or their reader is going to leave them. Yeah. And so I think there's a long-term view of, I see it actually more in the pro bono stuff than I do in the for pay, because oftentimes you're inherently coming from inner city or a different caste location in society, and this is a glimmer of hope. And if you just flash it in the pan like a cork or a fake piece of mica that you think might be gold, I mean, then they're never going to climb out of, realize that they are the ones that can climb themselves out of the hole, and they're stuck in the thought and the habit of the hole.
Rather let's give Joel a crack at this. Joel was listening quietly on YouTube, but he decided to join us, so I suspect he may have an opinion or two on this point. Joel?
What's the paragraph?
The paragraph is
209.
207 through 209, something like that. I mean, the main issue is the ethical responsibility of the psychotherapist or any professional. As Jordan says, it applies to Thoreau, and I say it applies to what I'm doing here. The ethical responsibility to keep going even if your patient can't pay. Yeah, I don't suppose in the way you work, this doesn't come up very often, but because you're working for the court, and so presumably they're paying you.
The ethical standpoint of an analyst, a Jungian analyst, is to deal with his shadow and do not bring problems that to your patient that don't belong to him, but about this is about payment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't refuse, for example, people that can't pay, or if they can't pay the value of the session. For example, I can pay this. It's happening to me, things like this and this and this. No, that's okay. That's okay. All things must pass. This is going to pass. I don't refuse. I did not refuse any patient who could not pay because they were really searching for help. It's a real necessity. It's a real necessity. And
so
I work. Okay.
In your case, you're not paid by the court, you're paid by the individual when you're giving your testimony.
Yes, but for example, I work in I don't know how this is dysfunctions in the United States, but I work at the mayor. The mayor works at the.
Yeah, I think we deal with it in family court. The types of things you deal with.
Okay, family court. For example, I work in we call an unity of health, with a low wage
Mhm.
to work with people, with poor people
Mhm.
in the city of Victoria.
Yeah.
And I also asked to work at the most difficult places, because I know that I would be useful in those communities.
Mhm.
Joel,
Okay.
you know, I appreciate that you assign an actual value to the fact of the currency that they came in earnest looking for help.
Yeah.
They're not flagellating around in a poor me abandonment piece and looking for their next, you know, person to suck dry, with a poor me, that they're legitimately looking in earnest for help. And just that, I mean, if anything, that can comp the first session, but that give them, basically throwing the buoy or the little ring out on the boat. Grab this, it'll help you swim, or we can pull the rope and pull you in, so that they can begin to learn how to do it themselves. Because if they're in earnest looking for, the word help is wrong, the word assistance and establishing a relationship with themselves.
Yeah.
That,
Okay.
that
Let's move on here. If you don't mind, I'm sorry,
No,
but I'm trying to keep things moving. So I'll go ahead and read 210. Dreams contain images and thought associations, which we do not create with conscious intent. They arise spontaneously without our assistance and are representatives of a psychic activity withdrawn from our arbitrary will. Therefore, the dream is, properly speaking, a highly objective natural product of the psyche, from which we might expect indications, or at least hints, about certain basic trends in the psychic process. Now, since the psychic process, like any other life process, is not just a causal sequence, but is also a process with a teleological orientation, we might expect dreams to give a certain indicia about the objective causality, as well as about the objective tendencies, precisely because dreams are nothing less than self-representations of the psychic life process. Anybody want to talk about that?
I think the teleology piece, I mean, the dreams are serving their purpose rather than coming from a cause. I mean, and there's
Right.
a more
It's not cause and effect. It's not logos. It's eros.
Right.
It's coming from your living psyche. And the way I have come to say it is that dreams and visions are things that your psyche thinks you need to know now in your conscious mind. And
well, and I think to address the logos to eros right there, I think you brought up a great point, because it's the eros pouring out, but then our life and our experience becomes the logos vessel,
right,
to fill that heart of the matter with. And then the quote unquote dead logos, so to speak, is the form that an identity takes. And it doesn't need to have a wall as a boundary. It can have a feeling and eros nature to its shape, so to speak. But it brings
right.
then the
And
logos becomes a vessel to pour the heart of the matter eros into.
Yeah, and often we don't remember our dreams, and that's, I regard those as non-essential, right? In other words, yes, our psyche is providing compensations to various little slings and arrows that come at you during your waking life. And they provide compensation to that, but you don't necessarily have to do anything about them. It's just saying, this is this, this is this, this is this. And it's only when it forces its way through and gives you a big dream that you really have to pay attention. It makes sense.
I think it's interesting. I take issue with the word non-essential. I get it. But to me, it's almost, rather than non-essential, similar in concept to me. They're hidden. The dreams I don't remember, I feel like are probably making deposits to my intuition bank account. And they're filling up places in the conscious with instantly utilizable unconscious contents, as if things aren't, I don't have to like peer in to fish the fish from the deep every time. That then there's a conscious component that's, call it the where are the diplomats, not the consulate, the building, say U.S. has a building in another country. I can't believe I can't remember the word. Embassy. Thank you. There's an unconscious embassy in the conscious where, it's populated. It's just not the whole of the ocean of the unconscious.
Well, and also, I take the position, and I don't know whether Joel will confirm this, but I take the position that we are dreaming all the time, consciously. Okay, I mean, actually, we're dreaming all the time. I know that if I just close my eyes and clear my head of what's going on around me in my waking life, I get scads of dreams constantly. I get all kinds of things coming at me. But what happens is, in waking life, it's like shining a really bright light on something. It blanches it out so that you can't see it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't respond to everything that's in dreams, or you'll make yourself crazy, and it won't do you any good, probably. But the things that the things that your psyche is really pushing to get through to your conscious mind, that you need to pay attention to. Big dreams and visions, things like that. It's very significant.
You don't want the fishermen to hook themselves and then be the beck and call of the unconscious being tugged back and forth. I mean, it's just like being the beck and call anywhere else. That's just going to erode you into deflation, because you're basically tossed around only, and you never have any perspective in the storm, so to speak.
Right. Okay, let's go into.
Can I ask you a couple of questions?
Go.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I want to read this this last couple of lines of 209. I suggested to her that we keep at least keep an eye open for any movements coming from a sphere of the psyche uncontaminated by our superior wisdom and our conscious plannings. So I always wonder, when you say stuff about being able to do all of this stuff while you're awake and stuff, like how can you be so sure that that's not just some cleverness of the conscious mind? I mean, I guess I'm genuinely curious.
I guess after long experience, I've learned to trust it. Nick, I mean, that's my answer. In other words, if somebody says something to me that my psyche reacts to, and it could react in a number of ways. I could have a hot flash. I could, my palms might start to sweat, or, I might start thinking of something else that's going on in my life that is either good or bad. Those are all messages. I take them all as messages. And so, at this point, so for example, when I broke my leg, boom, I'm down. I take today, maybe not in 1990, but in today, as I look back on it, I take that as a message from my psyche that says, you're not doing this. I have something else for you to do. This is not your fate.
Yeah, but it's only in hindsight that you're saying that, right?
Well, in that case, yes, but I mean, I very often have something happen. Hackles will go up in my head, or I've seen 3,000 movies at least, so, and many of them multiple times. So if I get a vision of a movie that comes into my head as an event occurs, that's my psyche telling me this is about this, pay attention. Okay, and that happens to me all the time. Okay, because I've seen 3,000 movies or more, I very often get presented in my psyche with scenes from a movie, and those come up whenever there's something that my psyche wants to tell me. It pulls up the exact right scene. Okay, instantly. It gives me the right scene. It's an image that's in my psyche, and it pulls up the scene, and I can recite the damn scene. I can recite the dialogue from the movie when that comes up like that.
And I would agree, Skip, completely. But I'll give an example. But first, I really appreciate, Nick, you saying, how do we know that's not just the conscious being, clever consciousness? And I look at it from a gardener's perspective, where if I move into a place and the whole backyard is just hard pan clay, well, I need three things. I need a pickaxe, I need black, fertile topsoil, potting soil, and then I need water. And I need to amend that soil. Well, I would look at that pickaxe as the unconscious penetrating into the conscious. Amending the soil would be conscious contents, and then the water is the unconscious itself. And I find that someone who's completely unaware of their inner workings is like that hard pan clay. They're brittle. It's the water, any influence just kind of, water off a duck's back. But I feel like then in that sense, instead of clever consciousness, it's the unconscious hydrating the conscious to become more dynamic and fluid and able to navigate. And I agree, Skip. When I snapped my knee and broke my ACL in a combination kick, I hadn't been in martial arts for 10 years. And this was 2 weeks in. And it was time to test up 3 black belts at one time. And for the time frame between then and that point, and I went through a combination kick that I used to do all the time. And I completely flexed my foundation leg, and I folded it to where I'm looking at my toes, and everybody in the room heard it like snapping a chicken drumstick off of the bread. I mean, and you just heard this, like people got tingles. But as this one nurse handed me this, bag of ibuprofen, she said, "What do you feel?" And I said, no, I'm not coming back. This is not my path. And that was my leg, where, just the sequence of events, you do not fully extend to hyperextend your leg. I mean, it's like skiing with no ACL. You can do it if you just don't, overextend. But that moment was a message. And I went, yeah, no. This is not going to be my new career. This is not going to be the path anymore.
I'm personally not so sure. I mean, I'm not, to each their own in this regard, but my feeling is always that I'm not so sure that whatever I might kind of devise in my conscious mind is not my own way of being defended against whatever is in the unconscious, because defense mechanisms certainly exist, and if we take up the whole scheme of thesis and antithesis, then it's always going to be something that I don't know about myself. And as what's the guy in DC?
Well, let's put it this way, Nick.
As James Hollis is always saying, the problem with the unconscious is that it's unconscious. So whatever it is that's in there, we don't know.
Right, but it presents. Okay, so we have images in our unconscious, okay, of various kinds. It can be an image of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Now, before I said that, you weren't thinking of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, but now you can probably hum the first few bars of it without any problem. And so we all have an image of that. And, last night at the Olympics, everybody was coming into the stadium and they're playing Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Well, I don't know what percentage of the people in the room or in that building knew that they were hearing Beethoven's Ninth, but anyway, they knew it was a familiar song or a familiar tune. They've heard it before because it's on elevators, other places, right? And usually it has a positive meaning to people. It's called Ode to Joy, and so it has a joyous, triumphant sound to it that most people take in that way. Now, there may be some that take it in a negative way. That's also possible. But we are filled with images. That's what Jungian psychology is about. And so whatever that image is, whether it's a scene from a movie or a song that you like, or hackles on the back of your neck, your body is communicating with you. Now, in my case, because I'm 99% intuitive, I've grokked it. I get it, that's what's happening. If you're not that intuitive, I'm sorry, I'm blind to what you don't get. But what I can say is that I know. Okay, I don't have to question it. When an image comes to my mind when something is happening to me, whatever it is, okay, it can be anything. When an image comes to mind, I know it means something. Some of them I know exactly what it means. For example, I've often talked about the image of the police car going across in front of me, okay, with the word police on it. That's the image that I see. But every time, exactly every time that image comes to mind, with the exception of when I'm describing it on these sessions, every time it comes to mind when I'm driving, I pay attention because there's police activity in the area. Okay, so
I think you're both saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Because just like Skip, your experience over decades has created a discriminating, discerning containment vessel. And then Nick, you're talking about, the unconscious. James Hall's problem with the unconscious is it's unconscious. And you're establishing a positive identity and relationship with it, where you're not going to just take anything that comes. You have an identity, and it's secure in itself, such that the clever consciousness parries with the conscious, but it also is informed and educated by the unconscious. So that I think you're both
so yes,
talking about.
You have to apply logos to it. You can't just accept it willy-nilly, because it might be all screwed up in a certain case.
And also too, I
it
think
might not be appropriate, right? And so you have to make a conscious decision about that, a logos decision. Go ahead.
And I think
Sure.
going back to the unconscious hydrates the brittleness of the conscious. It can be taught to be more fluid. Instead of applying logos or the consciousness to the unconscious, or instead of applying what we know, I think there becomes that tutelage of the unconscious, making the conscious more dynamic, that doesn't need anything applied whatsoever. There comes in instinct and intuition and actionable things in the moment that were really wonderful navigation. Simply
Right.
just natural.
And so what is it that just happened, Nick? I bring up my vision of the police car again. Okay. That's my unconscious telling me that this image has relevance, and how I interact with this image has relevance to what we're talking about now. That's exactly what it was. Okay. I wasn't thinking about that vision before I began the last minute or minute and a half of this conversation. I wasn't thinking of that at all.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it comes up and I say, I've talked about this lots of times before, but this is what it does, what happens.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry if I've aggravated you with the question.
No, you're not aggravating me. Don't be silly.
I mean, it's a genuine question for me, and it might, I'm just always in a place of thinking, I don't know how I can bypass my own tendency to be defended against that which I'd like to not know about myself, other than to pay attention to my dreams. And that's just my feeling. I don't know if the same is true for other people.
You're saying you don't want to know something about yourself?
I'm saying I don't know how to bypass the process of being defended against what I don't know about myself, if not only by paying attention to my dreams. That seems to me like the only surefire way of getting a different perspective on myself.
Yes, so that you're not letting your guard down, but you're allowing the expectation of that this is something you don't want to know to be dropped, and you actually will be aware and listen, not necessarily take it in, but you will be aware of consciously experiencing that instead of coming in with guards up.
Yeah, Nick, all I would say is the dreams were the first thing that Freud was talking about. Okay, and when he was doing his initial work and studies and writing his book about dreams. So dreams are the first thing, but what Jung has given us is the significance of the images that appear in our psyche. And so it's not only dreams, it's images that come to your mind during your waking life. And those images come up all the time. I mean, for example, you could have an image of me being the devil right now because you and I are at odds with one another. Okay, that could be coming up in your psyche, and maybe not. I hope not, but nonetheless.
Certainly not.
I don't see it as at odds with each other. I hear each of you telling.
Let's hear Jewel. Go ahead, Jewel.
I hear each of you telling your perspective. And I was a little taken aback when the dreams aren't important. And I went, okay, just listen. And I am on a journey that I'm using a dream journal. And I, in doing that dream journal, I recognize something that these readings tonight are really giving me clarity on. And it goes back to the very first paragraph of it was more than the individual. And that is my collective, the generations behind me and moving in the future. And I'm going to go back to that sentence that was just read, because I thought that was fascinating going through and hearing it. I suggest that we, to her, that we keep an eye open for movements. And that's what Jordan was talking about, movements with what he was given that picture there. And from a sphere of the psyche that's uncontaminated, okay? This is something that happened to us, and we don't need to, as it moves to the next part, analyze it with our brains and with our physical situations and let it go back. And there was a dream to where it was somebody said, you're always in high school. Well, I know what it is. That's when trauma took place. And so that trauma is still in my body. And that's why if I overanalyzed high school, then I went back to the feeling instead of the thinking. And that's what I need to deal with. And that's why I'm here with you guys tonight. And I didn't have brothers. And this is like a whole new experience for me.
Very well said.
I know are different.
Very well said.
Men are for whatever and women are, and I thought that's the truth. But I get it. It's the question and how we go to the same road. We're all going down the same road.
Yes.
One may decide to take one vehicle, one the other. We may take an interstate, and somebody says, what's an interstate? Or a back road, or flying the airplane. But we're all going there together. And that's the main thing about it. And we all use these tools in one way or the other, and we may be better at using a specific tool on this journey. But in this journey, we see how everybody has a big tool bag. And so when we say something, we can honor their tool.
You know, it's interesting you say that with perspective, because a Native American friend of mine a while back, we met when I was like 30. She goes, if you had a Native American name back then, what would it be? I went, oh, probably something like runs with scissors. You know, but you know, and it's funny now. And then I was like, wow, I'm still alive. That's cool. But it's interesting, you know, Skip, you brought up Freud and dreams. That's the exact opposite of this client of Jung's, where she grew up in a feeling relationship with her dad or her father. And so she overcompensated to be fascinated by the intellectual. Makes me wonder if Freud grew up in an overly intellectual, unfeeling place. And so he initially became over fascinated by dreams. I mean, to our benefit, but which goes back to then, you know, Nick, of what do we cherry pick? What do we ingest to enhance ourselves versus, you know, well, you know, I'm standing behind my wall with the arrow slot. You know, I got a view. I was like, are you going to attack me, or is this, you know, friendly coming in?
You know,
there's a couple of things I'd really like to add before I forget them. I think the process of working with dreams is much like writing an autobiography versus having someone else write a biography about you. You know, I can tell you all the things that I'd like to believe are true about myself and the things that I'm aware of about myself. But inevitably, if you wrote it about me, you would probably tell me some things I didn't know about myself. And I probably wouldn't be as willing to admit about myself, whether good or bad. Who knows? But I think that also brings up the issue of there being a necessity for another person, because even if I want to work with my own dreams or do whatever, I can never escape the standpoint of my own conscious position. I'm always going to be within my ego's standpoint, talking about my dream or talking about myself or anything. And that's why I think it's so valuable to work with one's dreams, but also to do it with another person.
But that other person can be the writer of a book. Okay, which is exactly why Jung has been my analyst, even though he died when I was 15. Okay, because he can serve as my analyst even though he was dead. Okay. You know, actually John Beebe said that to me explicitly in one of our videos with him. He said, Jung's your analyst to me. Okay,
I think,
but I knew that before he said that, but yes.
Right.
I think we're melding our minds when we come together. And I think a dream partner does bring so much more into it. And the collaboration brings more into it. And it gives more perspectives. And it's back to the elephant in the room. We're all right.
Well, it's like watching a horror movie. It's like, don't go around the corner. You know, don't you hear the reek, reek, you know, the dangerous violin music? That means don't go around the corner. Except we see that, but the actor doesn't see that.
Right, but I have to ask the question, Joel, what is the elephant in the room in this case?
I think that we all see something from a different perspective, and we're growing to understand a whole. the whole picture of what we don't see. It's like when Jordan said about the candle and he moved it. I thought, well, maybe it was in her perspective where she liked it. And did you flip it just to take care of your own? And I'm thinking, and she flipped it back. So of course, then you're talking about the comedy and all of that. But it's in telling the stories it gets richer and richer and deeper than that
Right.
one scene.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I
Well,
want to say one other thing Joel said that really spoke to me and my heart so much. And I think, Jordan, you were talking about handing a life jacket. It's what he was offering
Yeah.
when somebody is out there drowning. The other part of that is the people that he sees, he sees their heart. They're not a commodity coming in to make him a buck. And that's what I saw was his heart and soul.
You know, that reminds me, that's the seeing the heart and the soul, except not seeing it from the front. That throwing someone a life jacket is one thing. Knowing how to tie your jeans legs so you can put them over and make them into a life jacket. And then how to save a drowning person. You don't do it from the front. You do it from the back, and sometimes you knock them out. And so it's interesting. I mean, a WSI training kind of thing where, you know, okay, you tread water for an hour and a half, and now you have to go save this person who's flailing around. Well, you go underwater and come up from behind, and that way they can't defend, and then you're having to actively save them. But the thing is, a person in therapy is probably not they may be a drowning person, maybe not, but you can't come at them defensively, you know, and it's not an argument. It's getting behind to give them a bigger perspective of what they see in front of them.
We cannot see our back from ourselves.
Right.
That's why we need the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's when someone says, "I got your back." Well, that's what they mean. I can help you get perspective so we can both thrive.
Right on.
I got you guys. I say thank you.
The
Thanks, sis.
interesting thing about the Traumedeutung, the interpretation of the dreams that Freud wrote, is that we have the opportunity and the possibility to make a Jungian approach of that book. It reminds me the dream Jung had that Freud was working in the frontier, and Jung passes through this frontier. Do you remember this dream, Skip? In
No, I
Memories,
don't remember
Dreams, Reflections.
I don't remember it explicitly. There was a dream in which Freud appeared in Jung's dream.
Yes, Freud appears in Jung's dreams, and he's working.
He works as like a patrolman for the border in the Alps or something.
Oh yes, that dream. Oh yes.
That dream.
Okay, yes. Yeah. So what is your point about that dream, Joel? I do know it now.
It's that Jung goes beyond Freud.
Right. He realizes that that he's the dying principle.
Yeah, and he has his papers and hands them to Freud and crosses across.
Yes.
Yeah. And Freud analyzed the dream really well, and that destroyed the whole trip for the two of them.
Right.
Because it came up when they were on a ship together going to the U.S. and Jung has this dream, and the dream Freud correctly analyzes that he's going to have a problem with this guy.
Yeah, this is not protege any longer. This is competing colleague. Right.
And then on another occasion, it wasn't a dream per se, but when Jung took him on at a conference one time about the meaning of cutting out the name on Egyptian monuments by the sun. And Freud said, "Oh my God, he's gonna take me down." And he fainted. He fainted. He fainted
Well, yeah,
twice.
At that point, Jung was playing chess to Freud's checkers.
Oh yeah.
He got it. And
I think
Yeah.
the student who was then young surpassed the teacher.
yeah.
And,
Oh, definitely. Assuredly he did.
And I think absorbed him in a way, because he was already so logical and doctor from his, previous first part of his career. But Freud may have tempered him somewhat, like hardened the steel, but also made it a little more flexible to navigate rocks that he didn't need to deal with.
to me, that story is a good example of what Nick brought up in that sentence that we were reading, where the dream gave you something that we didn't want to contaminate it with our wisdom and our conscious plannings. And that's when the break took place.
Notice that even Jung had to go to somebody else.
Yeah. People are people,
Yeah. Jung knew that. I'm not sure Freud ever did.
Well, that's interesting where, Jung even himself had to, go to someone. I remember working in an art supply store after college, and Paul Servino, the new Perry Mason, walked into the fountain pen counter, and we're talking, and he's really likes Lamy pens, and so we're looking at this and that fountain pen, and at one point he goes, "You know who I am, don't you?" And I went, "Sure, Paul. You're the new Perry Mason, Paul Servino, and you have one of the hottest daughters on the planet, Mira. I mean, so what's with the question?" He goes, "You don't want my autograph?" I went, "No, Paul, I don't want your autograph unless it's on a big fat check." I mean, but it reminds me of everyone going to someone, because then that took his self-importance in a way and made him human. And the whole rest of the conversation was so much better, because I realized he had been on edge before, waiting for the starstruck piece to come out of the fountain pen salesman, and it didn't happen, other than if you wanted to give me a check. Anyway, but yeah, Jung had to go to someone.
Well, and Jung does, or at least my understanding is that Jungian analysts are expected to have their own analyst.
Yeah.
Even to
100 hours a year or something. It's 40.
Well, I don't know that it's 100 hours, but it's
40. I don't know the number.
It's some, people have to get their own life straight. And, I never aspired to become a Jungian analyst. I could have done it 25 years ago and thought about it, or 30 years ago even, I thought about it. But then I said, man, I can't think of anything worse than being in someone else's psyche, including multiple other people's psyche, for 6 to 8 times a day of somebody else. I have enough trouble dealing with my own psyche without having to try to put myself in the position of somebody else. This is why Nick and I are often breaking heads, because I don't want to get in Nick's psyche and he doesn't want to get in mine, I'm sure.
It's funny that's what made your decision, because I had the same discussion with myself, and I had already had enough of errors and omissions insurance, enough of E&O as an architect. And the last thing I wanted to do is, one, go back to school to come out and pay more insurance. I'm like, no.
Right. And it came up in the practice of law with me, which I did for 5 years, where I started to do matrimonial cases. And after I'd done 5 of them, I said, I'm not going to do any more of these cases. I don't want to be in the midst of other people's trouble. And, literally, if you're taking matrimonial cases, you're constantly dealing with other people's problems. And
swimming in the sewage pool.
Yeah, I mean, I much prefer to make my own problems and hire attorneys rather than solve every problem.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'm good at that part.
211. Do you want to read it, Jewel?
All right, 211. On the basis of these reflections, then we're subjected to the dreams to a careful examination. It would lead too far to quote word for word all the dreams that now followed. Let us suffice to sketch their main character, the majority referred to by the person of the doctor, that is to say, the actors were unmistakably the dreamer herself and the doctor. The latter, however, seldom appeared in a natural shape, but were generally distorted in a remarkable way. Sometimes this figure was of supernatural value. Sometimes it seemed to be an aged father, extremely aged, and then again he resembled her father, but was at the same time curiously woven into nature, as in the following dream. Her father, who in reality was a small creature, was standing with on a stature. Thank you. Let me start again. Her father, who in reality was of small stature, was standing with her on a hill that was covered with wheat fields. She was quite tiny beside him, and he seemed to her like a giant. He lifted her up from the ground and held her in his arms like a little child. The wind swept over the wheat fields, and as the wheat swayed in the wind, he rocked her in his arms.
Well, we all need that.
Mm-hmm. So she needs to birth from the father rather than the mother.
Yep.
Because that's a very well-lit womb, WMB image going on there. The swaying and the swaying, or the rocking in the swaying. There's like gears in a clock, and big ones, small ones, little, but they're all synchronized. And I think the swaying and the rocking there are very synchronized, as if she needs to now birth from her father.
I don't know if I'd read this earlier, and that's why when I made the comments earlier after reading this part, that I felt that he was holding on to her as a child.
Mm. Oh.
And therefore she was needing to be born into who she's coming to be.
Yeah, the child becoming the parent of the woman.
Right. And she's becoming an adult child, which means she's still his child, but she's now in an adult body.
Yeah.
And that could be his perspective, but always my kid, but not hers. She grows up. And
that's where there's when we lose something, even though we have it, things change again.
Yeah, but that's the divine child too.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That's being born again, I think, in Christianity.
Mm-hmm. And also that this brings to light the problems with how many people's families hold them back. Well, if you don't just stand up and be yourself, they just remember your last milestone in a moment. They remember who you were when you interacted last, and then they don't see your evolutions if you're not right there in the same room. And so when you say something like, oh, well, that's nonsense, you need to, well, they're pushing you back to where they remembered you were instead of listening to where you are now. And it doesn't happen with every family, but there's a lot of that. If people, actually, like Nick said earlier, setting boundaries with the unconscious, it's not anything goes. It's here's the identity. And it's not even stay the course or, stick to your guns. There's a lot of, no words, staring across the table until they get a chuckle and then, okay, I see that this is what you're doing now.
Yeah.
And to me,
instead of pulling back.
Some people try to keep us in the past that they knew us. And if we come and we're so different, they're not happy and they try to pigeonhole us right back into it. And I'm not going back to where I was.
Right. And so my experience was when I was divorcing my first wife, my mother decided to put a stop to it by sitting me down in the living room and giving me a good talking to. And I said, Mom, you're out of line here. You know, this is not for you to resolve for me. I'm dealing with it. You cannot.
Right.
She, you know, she got it right away. My mom was pretty intuitive also, and she got it right away as soon as, you know, she started to give me this stiff talking to, and I said, Mom, you're out of line. You can't do this.
Yeah.
You know, I've made my decision and I know what I'm doing.
That's when our if I look at it from a business perspective, our job description has changed.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Right. Oh, definitely.
I'll tell you, I had experienced that Saturday. I was with my son and his family and children and the other mother-in-law, and I sat there and my whole body, not outwardly, is shaking, and I'm recognizing we have 3 generations here. I don't know what my new role definition is, you know. And so that's where I've got to figure it out and keep speaking up. And right now we're not butting heads, but well, we know it's changing and we have to be adult about it and communicate, but we don't know.
Well, you certainly can offer wisdom, but you also have to recognize that as we get older, and I'm facing this both with myself and my mother-in-law, who's 91, that ultimately we're going to be cared for by the younger generation. And so the role between the two changes. Okay? And, you know, my mother-in-law is constantly trying to pull out her wallet to contribute $5 to a cup of coffee. And I said, no, you know, we're taking care of this now. And now we do buy all of her food, basically, and take care of her in many other ways as well. And, you know, she's having difficulty relaxing to that fact that we're taking care of her. We're not going to put her in a nursing home. We're going to take care of her. And
that's a really good example, Skip, because of especially around money. I remember my dad and my granddad at the Mexican restaurant after church every Sunday. We'd go for Mexican, and that was just a ritual. And no, I'll pay. And I started a ritual 3 weeks in a row, and they came to a different 3 weeks later. They both said, okay, let's decide who's paying before we go in, because Jordan's going to mess it up again. Well, right when they started arguing, I walked up to the maitre d' and I handed him a $100 bill, and I went, just let them go until they're finished, and then let them know it's already taken care of. And I will tell you, I thought it was funny. My stepmother thought it was funny. My grandmother thought it was brilliant. They both hated it because I one-upped them by going behind their back. And that's just that thing about, you know, $5. It's actually important to people that I support you, kind of thing. And they don't want to give up the helm in that way.
And I think it's also taking responsibility and not always being a dependent child.
Right.
Goes back to this reading we're doing today.
Yeah, when you lose something, for example, when people decide or are forced to stop driving, you know, for their own safety or others, in a sense, they need to find another hobby, something to fill that, so that they don't have so much driving remorse because they can't get themselves around town like that anymore.
Yeah.
You know, or take a trip.
Well, my mother-in-law just sort of became semi-blind, so she gave up her keys pretty easily. Okay, 212. Jordan, you want to go for it?
Certainly. Yeah, you don't get many seeing eye dogs in front of a car.
Yeah.
Okay, paragraph 212. From this dream and from others like it, I could discern various things. Above all, I got the impression that her unconscious was holding unshakably to the idea of my being the father lover, so that the fatal tie we were trying to undo appeared to be doubly strengthened. Moreover, one could hardly avoid seeing that the unconscious placed a special emphasis on the supernatural, almost in quotes, divine nature of the father lover, thus accentuating still further the overvaluation occasioned by the transference. I therefore asked myself whether the patient had still not understood the wholly fantastic character of her transference, or whether perhaps the unconscious could never be reached by understanding at all, but must blindly and idiotically pursue some nonsensical chimera. Freud's idea that the unconscious can, in quotes, do nothing but wish, Schopenhauer's blind and aimless capital W will, the Gnostic demiurge, who in his vanity seems himself perfect, and then in the blindness of his imitation creates something lamentably imperfect. All these pessimistic suspicions of an essentially negative background to the world and the soul came threateningly near. And there would indeed be nothing to set against this, except a well-meaning, in quotes, you ought, reinforced by a stroke of the axe that would cut down the whole phantasmagoria for good and all.
Nick, you want to comment on that?
He stepped away. It's like,
oh, okay. I'm responding over on. Let's see.
Interesting to me. I mean, in the last several months, I've realized that when someone says you ought, you should, they're projecting. And I often will come back with, are you processing your mom or your dad right now? I mean, because there's an authority figure, and you ought and you should to me are almost 100% indicators of their projecting. And what I love here is against this, except a well-meaning you ought, meaning Jung is understanding that he's about to project in the context of being that father lover figure. And the well-meaning you ought is different than coming back at someone with, I'm not taking that in parentheses, is this your mom or your dad, or mentor, tormentor somewhere. So I really respond there to the well-meaning you ought. It's so showing Jung is conscious of his place of having the choice to actually project instead of just going through projection.
Yeah, it occurs to me that you can't teach your psyche anything. And I'll ask Joel whether he concurs with that assertion, but I know that Jung was very upset when he was in Africa, and he was hoping to have dreams about the natives that he was dealing with and so on Mount Elgon. And what he was having was dreams about stuff that was going on at home and not about what was going on in Africa. And so it seems that the unconscious, the psyche, has its own agenda, and you're probably not going to change that very much. Joel, would you concur with that or not?
I totally agree with that.
Uh-huh.
Psyche has its own agenda.
Wait a minute.
The experience is personal.
I wonder if Nick had something that showed up 93 million miles away that he's got. It seems like a video is playing, some news story.
No, that was on my phone. I apologize
Oh,
for that. I finally caught the recalcitrant part of my technology.
You got to ground the phone.
I'm sorry. What, Joel, could you sort of repeat in essence your comment, because I was distracted by my iPhone?
I think that Jung made his trips, his journey to Africa, to India, to United States. As a result of the inner journey that he had himself, that he had with himself.
Yeah.
And so we have also Jung, the anthropologist, and I remember that Jung said that he wanted to make those trips, those journeys to Africa to know. I think that he was developing his inner notion of the other.
Right.
He was going in the direction of the other, or the direction of the otherness. He said something about I am an European man, and I want to. I think that he was trying to know himself and to experience himself like this. Where do I fit, and where I do not fit?
Yeah.
I think that his journey was some kind of inner recognition and the recognition of the other.
Yeah, I think that
He
that's
was developing alterity, the otherness. It's because it came to my mind now, the Latin word alteritas. And I think that in English maybe is the word the otherness.
Yeah,
respecting the difference that the other constitute to himself.
Yeah, I concur with your observation about the other. I know he was trying to do that, and I concur with you absolutely. I don't want to overvalue his perceptions as an anthropologist, however. I mean, he had some very good insights, for example, on Mount Elgon, and also with Mountain Lake, the Pueblo chief, or the Pueblo individually actually turned out not to be a chief. But anyway, the
Lake Mountain, I guess his name, the mountain of the lake.
Mountain Lake, I think. What
Mountain Lake,
yeah.
Yes.
But I also want to observe that many of his observations on those trips were the observations of a neophyte, and they weren't he just didn't have enough experience with international travel, in my view. Okay, now this is coming from a guy who's I've been to India 44 times. He went once for 6 weeks. I probably spent 2 years in India. He never went to Arabia. I went there. I went to Saudi Arabia 23 times, and I probably have been in Dubai 75 or more times at this point. And so, and I was always looking for what is the distinction? What is it? I was always looking for something interesting. And what I found after numerous trips was I could never find any real difference. In other words, I found this right from when I was 32 years old, so that was 43 years ago. I found that, I went to Barcelona as my first international trip in business. I had gone to high school in Japan, of course, before that, but I was very disappointed that everything was really the same. Okay, there were, cultural differences like the Gaudi Cathedral, but the fact that all of my colleagues from around the world, 16 different countries, who spoke probably 25 languages among us, got drunk in the same way, and we weren't really that different. Okay, not a bit. I mean, we used to hire Belgians because they were the Swiss Army knife of international business. Belgians typically speak 4 languages, and so you could hire a Belgian and send him anywhere, and he could go to French colonial Africa, or he could go to Latin America, or he could go to Sweden, or he could go to Great Britain and get along somehow. And so while I do agree with you that he was looking for the other, I'm not sure he found it sufficiently. Okay. I had never thought of it in that way. As a matter of fact, until you brought it up just now, I had never thought that he was looking for the other. But yes, you're right. There's no doubt he was doing that. That was the reason for the trips to the different places. He actually went to Africa twice. And I think he went to Jerusalem once, even for a couple of weeks. He found enough based on what he was doing to make some useful comments about it. But I don't think he really found the other in himself. And I looked for it. I mean, I remember landing in Jeddah I actually remember landing in Jeddah for the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th times, and looking out the window as the city came into sight at the airport in the airplane. And I said, saying to myself, why am I doing this? Because I've done this, all these other times before, and it's just the same. There's nothing interesting about it.
It's interesting, Skip. I think you're really hitting home that you get past the architectural and urban design and quirky differences between cultures, and you do see the sameness. And I think, as Mark Twain, said, that the best cure for racism is travel, because you start to see that sameness and you get less judgy and more interested in the differences that are important. And I think your comment about that he was somewhat of a neophyte, when he was standing on that hill with the Kalahari, and he sees, the herds of animals just going about their business, running around, and nature happening, it wasn't that he was God on high. I think he grokked that this is what he's been talking about. And at the same time, it was just as basic as it was divine. So it
Yes.
wasn't, it's like
Right.
he had an experience of what he'd been talking about, but he might not have actually seen it with the majesty of herds of animals running around.
Yeah, it makes a difference. Obviously, you have to have the experience.
Right.
And for example, I was listening to or reading Colleen's book yesterday, and Colleen has developed very definitely techniques for breaking through to the unconscious through art. Okay, she definitely has done that. And you know, when I started to work with her, I was immediately feeling it. Okay, and you know, it's like we're talking about imagery in the NFT space and Bitcoin, and you know, the imagery that I was presented when we were in Aptos, you know, she definitely has got it vis-a-vis art, but the insight that I've brought recently that I haven't found anywhere else is the insight that art and philosophy, psychology, and religion, and now sports, we can point to the Olympics as being this as well. They're all pointing to the same thing. They're all pointing to the healing, making accessible the healing power. Okay, when you're very active in a sport, I'm not talking about people who are fans here. I'm talking about people who are actually down on the field. But when, you know, I'm sure that when, you know, a great quarterback is in the flow, he's definitely got something coming from the unconscious. He's definitely close to the healing power, the unconscious power, which, you know, we've been calling for several thousand years God. Honestly. and so, you know, he is, you know, a great quarterback who all of a sudden is in the flow and whack, 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 he knocks out 4 touchdown passes to win the game. That guy is close to what we call, or, you know, human beings have called God for millennia.
And that's a great example with that quarterback in the zone that becomes a class 5 rapids raft guide shooting the river, literally bam, 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 all the rocks in the river, all the obstacles, all the currents, all the movement.
Exactly.
You know, it's not chaos. There's this point of he's then swim, surf, living through all of those flows with calculated dynamism that he might not even be calculating. You know?
Yeah, I doubt if he is.
It's just everything feels to boom.
You know,
boom.
it's. I went to a conference on Zen one time, and I asked the guy who was teaching the course, "What is Zen about?" Okay, what is Zen about? And he gave just 2 examples: riding a bicycle. As long as you have to think about steering and balancing and braking, you can't ride a bicycle. It's only when you can stop thinking about it, only then can you ride a bicycle. You can't think about it. If you think about it, you're going to fall. And all of us.
That's the train so that the mind train hard enough so the mind forgets and the body remembers. So you're
right. And all of us here tonight, in terms of typing, is the other one, where as long as you have to think about where the F key is or the K key, you can't type. But as soon as you can forget about where the keys are, then you can type. Okay. And And so, I used to talk about the combat officers phenomenon, I used to call it, which was because I didn't know what it was, but what I knew is that people like Patton or MacArthur, they never worried about getting shot. Okay. And they would walk up to the front lines and people would be sniping at them and all sorts of stuff. And they would, wouldn't pay any attention to it. And so, I asked myself, there are people that I knew in Vietnam who were never afraid of getting killed. Okay. They just went out and did their thing. And speaking for myself, I was always afraid of getting killed. And I wanted to know what the distinction was between me and that other officer who was behaving in that Zen way. And that was it. It was all about flow and being connected to the unconscious and the healing power. Now, later on, I grokked it. Okay. I grokked it 35 years or more than that, almost 40 years ago. But I kept asking people what it was, and nobody knew until I had this Zen class, and then I got it. Okay.
It's funny to imagine the Zen teacher, if you asked him what is Zen about, and he just told you Zen is about nothing.
Yeah, something like that. But it is about experience. Okay. And
the evolution of experience. I mean, you brought up typing. So I'm going to go ASDF, JKL, semicolon, ASDF, JKL, semicolon. After a while, you know where they are. These days, though, every once in a while when I'm writing, I'll just start laughing because I'm like ASDF, JKL, wink, ASDF, JKL, wink. I mean, because it's a semicolon can do two things now. And so it's.
Yep. So anyway, I don't know, did anything I said make any sense to you, Joel?
It makes a lot of sense. It reminded me a book I read, the art ART of the Zen archer.
Ah, yes.
Art of archery.
And he in the end of the book, he lived 5 years in Japan, American man, or professor. And after 5 years, he discovered that he himself was the arrow, the string, and the arch.
Mm-hmm.
And he was also the target.
Yes, he became the target. Yeah.
Well, that book is wonderful. What struck me was the how to let go of the string, where you let go as a baby lets go. Because when a baby lets go of your hand, you don't feel it let go, it's just gone. And there's this natural smoothness that goes from squeezing to being completely open with almost zero transition, almost like a violin doing one long note that you never feel the bend do. But in that word, that the Zen piece is going back to letting go of the string. It's like riding the bicycle rather than thinking about how to ride the bicycle.
Yeah, last night I had the wonderful opportunity to see this incredible musician. Where I live here in Boone, North Carolina, it's kind of out in the country, more or less. It's a small town, and a friend of mine that lives close to here, about 45 minutes away from here, has built like a large barn at his house where he has concerts and stuff like that. So last night, they had arranged for this musician. His name is Gabe Marin. He plays in this group called Consider the Source. to come play a solo show there. And this group is really, really unique because they play Turkish and Persian music with kind of like a kind of fitted to a rock and roll audience. So they're taking really, really ancient music and just making it relevant to the modern era and putting it to bass and drums and stuff like that. But he came up here and he played a solo show. So I got to go sit like 5 feet away from this guy and just watch him play all of this music, which is seemed deeply religious and just primordially ancient. But the thing that was so striking to me is that when he finished, he was like, this was more or less entirely improvised. And, he sat there with his eyes closed in pretty much what looked like a state of meditation for about an hour. And you could tell that there was no difference between him, what he was hearing, what he was playing, his instrument. It was all just one thing in a very deep state of at one, if you will, with his instrument and his music. And it was just a really, really great opportunity to get to see something like that. But that's sounds like very
You
much
see
in line
that,
with
and
what
see that in all jazz, in all capable jazz musicians, you see that.
Yeah.
Phenomenon. Right.
Nick, that's a great example. I love bands that take the primal and the ancient and the, I don't know if you're familiar with, not the Who with Roger Daltrey, but the Mongolian band, metal band, the Who, with they utilize throat singing, 2 voices in one. And
oh no, yeah, I do know what you're talking about. Yeah.
yeah, you see that, you get the tingles as if I'm listening to the sitar somewhere else, but it's got an amp, so it's interesting when you mentioned at one-man, and even in that word pronounced differently is the other of atonement. But the at one-man is the point of what he's doing, what he's hearing, what he's playing, what he's feeling. It's all, like you said, it was all one thing.
Yeah.
That at one-man.
Yeah, and it's just so moving to me because it's very much like you're describing the process of learning the keys or learning all of the art of battle and all of that stuff. It's like he's got a life's work of knowledge going into every single thing that he's doing with his instrument, yet you would never know it because it just looks so effortless, and he plays with such ease that there's no thought whatsoever.
I know 2 people that created their life around an organ. Okay, now one of them, I only saw him once, but he's in this hamburger joint in Indianapolis, Indiana, or near it. Okay, and it's they produce a good kind of hamburger, but whoever created this restaurant created this incredible organ that's very complex with all kinds of pipes and whistles on it. And this young man was playing the thing, and he was really getting into it. And my wife at the time said, wow, he's really into his music because his jaw was moving in a certain way and so on. And he was definitely making his life around that instrument. And the other one is a fellow who was in the Navy band. I don't know what instrument he played, but he got himself assigned to the Naval Academy band. And once he got here and saw the organ that's in the Naval Academy chapel, he refused to leave, and he's still there, and he's been there for probably 45 years now. He got out of the Navy after a certain amount of time as a bandsman, whatever he had to serve, but he came right back to that organ, and once he got his hooks on it, he won't give it up. And I don't know that I've ever heard anybody else play it, as a matter of fact.
That's his bicycle. Stay off. It's like-
Yeah, I mean, it's just pure pleasure for him. Well, I hope we made progress today. Usually when I can't remember what we talked about, I usually think it came from my deep unconscious, and I hope it's been useful for you.
I enjoyed
so-
the interplay. I mean,
Yeah, what did we finish? Did we read 212 or not?
we did. I made a mark at resume at 213.
All right. All right. So we'll have to look at that again next week. And
So maybe when
just-
we come back next week, we do the overlap, segue, reread 212, then go into 213. Since especially it's about the dream, and then we're going to go on from it.
Yeah, we might have to read the dream too. But anyway, so note that today is, I'm not sure of what the correct word is. It's something about, two numbers the same, then one different, then two numbers the same. So today is 221. Palindrome, yeah. 221-22, and tomorrow is 5 2s, 2/22/22. So it's my daughter's 45th birthday tomorrow. So, but besides being George Washington's birthday, but
President's Day, and in 200 years it'll be 22/22/22. So
Yeah.
if we can stick around like Yoda for 200 more years, we'll get that one.
yeah, 2/22/22, special day, I guess, after in some fashion. Anyway, thanks, Nick, for the repartee. It was interesting, useful, I hope.
Yeah, nice to be with you all.
Yep, that's good stuff.
And-
All right.
And now I have another
Oh,
sister.
we can't hear you, Jewel, because you're muted.
What?
Interested being with all you guys. And your humor.
I have two sisters. It's like,
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll see what happens next time. So peace and
have a good one, guys.
take care now. Bye-bye.
Okay, congratulations for your daughter's birthday, Skip.
Thank you. Yes, that's a big one for me.